Julia is a media strategist and award-winning filmmaker who's from Brazil. Her work has been exhibited at Sundance, Tribeca, Berlin, Jerusalem, and the Dubai International Film Festival, and broadcast on the BBC, HBO, Al Jazeera, and lots of television channels. Most recently, she directed and produced a movie that I think many of us saw called Budris, which had a palpable impact here in the United States and has been applauded for its powerful presentation of the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance in the Middle East. She produced My Neighborhood in 2012, which had its world premiere in the Tribeca Film Festival in 2012. She's been a guest on lots of television shows, including Charlie Rose, and her work has been instrumental in shaping media in the United States and beyond. She's received for her work a number of prizes, including the King Hussein Leadership Prize, the Search for Common Ground Award, and the 2011 Ridenour Film Prize. Julia is a team member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and her TED Talk, Pay Attention to Nonviolence, has been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. Julia Bacha, welcome to the program on negotiation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thanks for having us here for a second time. PON hosted also an event with Budrus, which was really inspiring. My colleague Ronit Avni was here and has since talked about it, so I was very eager to join all of you tonight. Thank you for coming in what is a freezing evening. I live in New York, but I wasn't prepared for Boston winter. And I wanted to, you already thanked so many of the people at PON and Nadav who have made this evening possible. Also, I want to thank my co-panelists for joining us here tonight. So I wanted to take my 10 minutes to briefly talk a little bit about Just Vision, which is the organization that produced the film, and give a sense of why we made this film and why we care so much about this issue. So Just Vision is a nonprofit organization. It was created, soon it's going to have its 10-year anniversary, which is pretty crazy to think about that. And the reason why we came into being was because we saw a huge gap in how media worldwide, but particularly in the United States, was covering Israel and Palestine. We witnessed over the course of decades now that there is an overwhelming bias in the media towards violence, which is not exclusively the case in this conflict. It's something that happens to many other conflicts, but it's very much, it has had a really negative impact on how the people on the ground who are working using nonviolence have been affected directly by it. Palestinians and Israelis who are using nonviolence in various forms have felt over the course of the decades invisible. And we know that because Just Vision was created after interviewing 450 of those individuals who overwhelmingly response when we asked what is the biggest challenge we face was invisibility. For the kind of work that they do on the ground to gain traction within their communities and also across the international community is really important for us to be paying attention to what they're doing and to the work they're doing. They really feed and thrive on it and are able to tell their communities that that work is actually leading to results and is having an impact if their cause and their case is getting media attention and is gaining them supporters internationally. So we were created, the sort of most visible demonstration of our documentation of this type of work is through the documentary films. There's a lot more work that we do, and I really encourage you to visit our website, justvision.org, where you can dive a lot more deeply than a 25-minute can on many of the issues addressed on the film. We have interviews with many of the individuals in this film in Budrus, and who are doing a lot of different kinds of work on the ground. Those interviews are in English, Hebrew, and Arabic, and they're a valuable instrument for people who want to understand what's going on the ground beyond the sort of sensational media coverage that we get on a daily basis. So how many of you have seen Budrus, just out of curiosity? Okay, that's a good number. For those who didn't, it's on Netflix, or you can buy it on Amazon.com. I highly encourage you to do so. And actually, this is the last little pitch. On the table, there's information about how to buy, where you can buy all of our films. And also, there is a sign-up sheet going around, which is shared between Just Vision and PON, if you want to stay in touch with our two groups. So for us, why My Neighborhood? Why did we decide this was so important to talk about right now? Just Vision has been working out of Sheikh Jarrah for 80 years. In fact, the first time I moved to Jerusalem, that's where we set up the editing room for our first film in Counterpoint. And so we became very familiar on a personal way with what was happening. And we saw in the last 8 years changes to the neighborhood taking place. And we were very aware of how explosive this particular neighborhood is. And I'm going to let Seidemann here talk more explicitly about why this neighborhood in particular and why this area is so crucial. But what was missing from some of the conversation that we felt around what was happening in Jerusalem, what actually does it look like for the people being impacted directly by the evictions happening there? What does that actually mean on the sort of granular level for these families? It's not like we had not heard about it, but it was always talked about in sort of very abstract terms, and we really wanted to dive in to particularly one family's story. And Mohammed's story was eventually the one that we decided to focus on. We filmed many families in the neighborhood. My co-director, Rebecca Winkler-Jabi, who is not here today, spent many years with the families before any of the families had been evicted. She was already there interviewing them. And we wanted to bring those stories so that we could have conversations about the larger picture, but without missing the sort of human level of this. And I wanted to just sort of, in terms of the larger picture, Just Vision is a nonpartisan organization. We do not take a stand on a one-state or a two-state solution. We're not religiously affiliated in any way. Our team is made of Israelis, Palestinians, I'm Brazilian. So we're a very international team. And our concern is really about how do you keep both societies, Palestinian and Israeli societies, in that region? How can you make it possible for both communities to thrive in an environment of equality and dignity, freedom and security? So those are the sort of values that inform us. And the displacement of Palestinians that is happening right now is in violation of every single one of these values. And it's a huge danger in so many levels, in the granular level of what actually happens to Jerusalem and how are we going to solve the problem of Jerusalem. On a geopolitical space, for Palestinians to be systematically displaced from the city as they have been over the course of a very long time at this point, but in the sort of last few years with a certain acceleration, it's a huge danger in terms of the perceptions in the Arab world, in the Muslim world. Jerusalem is a city that is really important for the three monotheistic traditions, and we should encourage for the three monotheistic traditions and beyond to be able to have a place in that city. And there is a sort of critical component that is often missed in the conversation that we wanted to add, which is the agency of people on the ground. Right? There are Israelis and Palestinians who are actually taking action and looking for ways in which their grassroots activism and their engagement on this issue can help move the conversation into a direction that is more inclusive of the needs and the rights of all populations. So you saw an example of this. There are many Israelis who continue this work. The work has actually expanded beyond the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah into other neighborhoods. So Sheikh Jarrah is just one example of something that is happening in different ways and with different legal stories behind it, but in several neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. And there is an organizing happening, and we really wanted to encourage the international community to learn about it and to find ways to support that work that is happening. I think I'll end here.
Terrific.
And I look forward to your questions.
Good. Well, we're going to have plenty of time for questions. Daniel Seidemann is the founder and director of Terrestrial Jerusalem, an Israeli non-governmental organization that he helped launch in January of 2010. It promotes an Israeli-Palestinian permanent status peace agreement by working to ensure that an agreement is possible on the issue of Jerusalem. He's a practicing lawyer and a partner in a firm that is specialized in commercial law. He's been interested in public policy issues and planning issues for some time. He's argued more than 20 Jerusalem-related cases before the Israeli Supreme Court, and he's also participated in numerous Track 2 talks on Jerusalem between Israelis and Palestinians. In 2000-2001, he served as in an informal advisory capacity to the final status negotiations. I gather that was probably during the Oslo negotiation. During the negotiations flowing out of the Oslo Accords, and perhaps Taba as well. And he's been on a committee of experts commissioned by Prime Minister Barak's office to generate sustainable arrangements geared to implementing possible understandings with Palestinians. He's been frequently consulted on all kinds of issues relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I want to welcome him to Harvard and say how pleased we are that he's here. Okay, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to begin with customary Israeli delicacy and understatement and ask about the film, so what? 8 Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah have been displaced in a world where we start counting casualties in the tens of thousands, whether it's in Darfur, a tsunami, or in Damascus. That actually was a question that I was asked specifically about this issue real time. In October 1998, on a Saturday night, 2 o'clock in the morning, I get a phone call that the settlers are trying to take over a house of a client of mine in East Jerusalem. I knew it wasn't serious because I had a court injunction. I knew the police would respect that injunction, but I raced over there knowing full well why this was being staged. On that night, holed up outside of Washington in Y River Plantation were President Clinton, Yasser Arafat, and Netanyahu, the original, not the sequel, and the settlers were afraid, rather foolishly, that they would arrive at an agreement and they wanted to derail the talks. This was a provocation. I get there and run into Faisal Husseini, the national leader of the Palestinians, and Faisal says to me, do you happen to have Dennis Ross's phone number in Washington? Dennis Ross of Dennis Ross and the Supremes. President Clinton's peace envoy. I had his cell phone. Faisal says, you dial, I'll talk. After 2 minutes, Dennis asks to talk to me and asks the following question. The President of the United States is in the next room. Why should the fate of one Palestinian family interest the President of the United States? It's a very good question, and that's the question I'm asking about Sheikh Jarrah. My answer to that is as follows. There are 3 dimensions to this conflict. One of them is rather mundane, terrestrial. It is a territorial conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And in that context, Sheikh Jarrah in and of itself is not terribly impressive. You have 8 families displaced, another 20 at risk, but it is part of a much larger development, and this is a thrust, a strategic thrust, to establish Israeli territorial hegemony over Jerusalem, the area surrounding the old city of Jerusalem, in a way that is incompatible with any possible, envisageable future political agreement, from my perspective, the two-state solution. It will entirely dismember the fabric of Palestinian urban life. This is a real and a clear and present danger, certainly to the two-state solution. It is a deal breaker, I believe, to any possible territorial dimension of this conflict. But that's the easy aspect. There are two other dimensions which I call the radioactive dimensions of the conflict. Most of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians can be solved by taking out the geographical scalpel and dividing things, politically perhaps physically. But the two radical dimensions, or the radioactive dimensions, are Jerusalem and refugees. These touch to the very core of identities of Israelis and Palestinians, and Sheikh Jarrah has won the lottery because they have all three dimensions concentrated in one small geographical area. What I would like to illuminate this by one small story. About 2 years ago, I got a phone call from a very prominent jurist in Israel by the name of Michael Ben Yair. Ben Yair was Yitzhak Rabin's attorney general until the assassination. He asked to meet me on a Friday afternoon in Sheikh Jarrah. He's about 71 years old. His sister is 85 years old. She came along. And he said, "You see this house over here in Sheikh Jarrah? I was born in that house. And look at what is happening in that house. There are Palestinians living in my ancestral home. There's a Palestinian flag painted on the side of that house. And you know what? That is exactly the way it has to be. I became a refugee in 1948, fleeing the neighborhood of Nachlat Shimon, which you're familiar with, and was given the home of a Palestinian refugee. They were given my home. There is not only moral logic in that, there is political logic in that. Israel's war of independence, he said, never came to an end. It will come to an end in Sheikh Jarrah, or it will never end at all. Not one hair should fall from the heads of the people who are living in my family home. It is not possible to address a 1948 refugee problem, which is an excruciating historical memory, when we are creating new categories of refugees out of those same 1948 refugees. You turn the Nakba, the formative experience of displacement of the Palestinian people, the fear of displacement, becoming refugees, you transform it from a painful historical event into a rolling, excruciating, contemporary event. It is not possible to address the refugee problem when you are creating new refugees. You've got two refugee societies. It is the Jewish and Palestinian. It is the rawest nerve of the conflict. The final point has to do with Mickey's sister. The reason the settlers target this area is because it resonates with biblical history. There is a genuine bona fide religious site, an ancient burial tomb associated with the burial place of the high priest in the Second Temple period. It's a bona fide Jewish religious holy site. I say it's bona fide because it's been the site of pilgrimage for about a millennium, since the early Middle Ages. Just down the road is an 800-year-old holy site which has existed for 20 years. There's a lot of instant sanctification going on. Take 2 teaspoons warm water, stir, and you get a holy site. No, this is real. I asked Mickey's sister, what was the use of the holy site like when you were growing up during the British Mandate? And her response was, it was locked 364 days a year. And then one day it would be opened up, Lag BaOmer, between Passover and Shavuot, and there would be a carnival-like celebration, a Hilula. We would be joined by Jews from all over mandatory Palestine, and joined by Palestinian Christians and Muslims in one religious celebration, something that would be unthinkable today, and then it would be locked again. Today, it is the 7-Eleven of holy sites. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, full service, all the time. What we are seeing in Sheikh Jarrah is the transformation of Sheikh Jarrah, Shimon HaTzadik, and the entire area and the visual basin of surrounding the old city into a pseudo-biblical evangelical theme park. This would be amusing were it not to be at our expense. We Israelis and Palestinians are fortunate enough to have a national political conflict which may be managed as a crisis by mortal men and women and ultimately resolved by political means. What we are witnessing in Sheikh Jarrah is not only poking your finger in the refugee problem, it portends the transformation of a national political conflict into a combination of Milchemet Mitzvah, Jihad, Holy War, Armageddon, Second Coming, hopefully in that order, and then we can all pack our bags and go home. And by the way, this is something in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims are participating with glee. Nobody is happier to see this transformed into a religious conflict than Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, etc. They aspire to a religious conflict for their own reasons. And Sarah Palin, Mike Huckabee, and the like spend more time in Sheikh Jarrah and Shepherd's Hotel than they do at Jesus' tomb. That is not only their theology, that's their politics. What we are seeing is a dangerous development. So why is Sheikh Jarrah important? Because it is Axis Mundi. It is a limited geographical area and a place where the tectonic plates of the Arab world, the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam meet up. And in this one small area, all of the components of the conflict are condensed. They have been run over by history. And what starts in Sheikh Jarrah doesn't end in Sheikh Jarrah. The cement in this Middle East is wet. My friends in the Jordanian and Egyptian foreign ministries don't know what their foreign policy is going to look like 6 weeks from now, much less 6 months from now. If this cement hardens against the backdrop of religious and national conflict in Sheikh Jarrah, we will be driving forces of potential moderation into exclusionary and very dangerous visions. What starts in Sheikh Jarrah does not end in Sheikh Jarrah. Thank you. We've got 10 minutes. I behaved myself.
I must say I've never moderated a panel before where there have been two speakers sequentially who met and in fact saved a little time on the 10 minutes.
We're scared of you.
Don't speak too quickly.
Thomas, there's a lot of pressure on you.
So you'll give the 1 minute, 2 minute warning then, right?
No, I'm sure you're going to do fine. Thomas Abowd teaches in the Department of Anthropology at Tufts. He's been involved for 2 decades in scholarly and activist projects related to Palestine, Israel, and the Middle East. He's the author of an upcoming book, Colonial Jerusalem, The Spatial Construction of Identity and Difference in a Divided City. He's the author also of National Boundaries, Colonized Spaces, The Gendered Politics of Residential Space in Contemporary Jerusalem. I must say that title kind of captures every kind of conflict element you can imagine. The Gendered Politics in Contemporary Jerusalem, in all events. Great title. He's at work on a study of racial politics in Detroit that details Arab American and black class racial and gendered encounters. He's been awarded a Fulbright Fellowship to do research in Jerusalem in this coming year.
Last year, yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks to the organizers. Good to see you all out on this cold and blustery night. I was wondering, because I'm neither Palestinian nor Israeli, I was trying to figure out what constructive role I could play on this panel, especially in 10 minutes, which is not my favorite format. So you really will have to police the time, Bob. But I decided to talk about this conflict and some of the themes that are raised by Julia's very fine documentary relating to housing and land politics, 2 of my interests and things that I've been concerned with specifically in Jerusalem for many, many years. And I wanted to do it since we all are sitting here in the United States, most of us Americans, to try to give a perspective that might help us, we Americans, engage this issue and perhaps change the policy of our government as well as raise public opinion, raise public awareness, change public opinion on this question. And I want to move from sort of one point of departure is this idea that was shared with me by the great, now late Israeli civil libertarian Israel Shahak, who in addition, Danny helped me a lot during my fieldwork too, he doesn't know that, but he claims to have remembered me as a small, young graduate student in 1999 in his office, and I learned a lot from Danny, and I learned a lot from Israel Shahak and other Israeli and Palestinian leftists and human rights activists. And Israel Shahak, who some of you may be familiar with, who passed away in 2001, had a couple of really good nuggets of advice, chestnuts of wisdom for we Americans, and how at this sort of crucial battleground on this conflict, what we should do, what is to be done. And he said, he not only, as I've tried to work under as well, assume and sort of claim this idea of equal rights and justice for every human being, but also, as Shahak said when we would ask him what he thought might be good strategy in the U.S. context, he said, you need to tell Americans, you need to go to churches and you need to go to universities and communities and really put the Palestine-Israel conflict in American terms. Tell them, for instance, people who don't know much about this conflict, what would you Americans think if suddenly the state of Massachusetts or the city of Boston or the United States more generally suddenly made formally off limits 80 or 90% of the land to non-Christians or non-whites? Well, we know we have some memory about what the racial exclusions and racial covenants meant in our white supremacist legacy here. But this idea I thought was a really good one. And, the survivor of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, Shahak, went on to say that this is really, he's all about tactics and trying to speak to the audiences that really need to be spoken to. And the American audience is certainly one of them. This sentiment this is kind of awkward because I don't know if you can hear me from this position, but this sentiment of equal justice for every human being and putting this conflict now, in its seventh decade in American terms was echoed and really enhanced by, very recently, by the brilliant thinker and political activist Angela Davis, who probably more of you are familiar with than Shahak. And you guys know who Angela Davis is, right? Okay. Fresh from her return from her recent visit to Israel and Palestine, she has written a really quite illuminating piece about the similarities that she, as a child of the white supremacist Jim Crow South, as a black woman, experienced, and how she saw similarities between African Americans in the Jim Crow America with Palestinians in contemporary under Israeli military occupation. And there are plenty of differences, but there are some key similarities, and she discussed those. And I think that's a good way also, when we talk about housing and land politics, to call on that legacy, which of course is not over, this legacy of segregation and apartheid America, but which has passed into a different phase, as we know. And the point of both of these thinkers, among the key messages that they were trying to communicate in these expressions of solidarity, was that this idea of universal values and universal principles and international law is really, really, really important to claim, I think. The notion that if segregation is wrong in Boston, it's wrong in Johannesburg, it's wrong in Jerusalem. And I think it's also a hopeful claim. I think it's a claim that challenges we Americans, but also takes Americans seriously. And Americans, I think, need to ask ourselves, since we are, after all, paying for this occupation over East Jerusalem and the rest of the territories occupied in 1967, what our own responsibility is in all of this. And, I'm a supporter, I should say. I'm a supporter of BDS. And I think that those in this country who are organizing around that framework need to be not only critical of Israeli institutions and Israeli power, but also about the American institutional link to these institutions. In some ways, on the left, it's easy, it's often easy to criticize Israel, but are we willing to turn the critical gaze back on our own state and our own populations, the Sarah Palins of the world, but also others, who are giving moral sanction and economic aid to this occupation. So what does putting the dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian context in American terms mean in the realms of just housing rights? Because I know I don't have a lot of time. Let me just give you a few snippets, and we can perhaps talk about this later. Since 1967, since the advent of Israeli occupation over this neighborhood, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the territories, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, the UN, and other human rights groups have come up with an estimate of about 28,000 Palestinian shelters or homes that have been destroyed since June 1967 by the Israeli authorities. And to put that in American terms, it's 26,000, 27,000 homes. It would be as if about 1.8 to 2 million American homes in the United States have been destroyed over that same 45-year period. But that's not the end of it, of course, because it would be 1.8 to 2 million homes destroyed by a foreign government that's internationally recognized as occupying American territory and who is engaged in this process of systematic house demolition and negation. And that number of structures, I calculated, it's not difficult, but that number of structures would be equivalent roughly, that number of structures could house basically the entire populations of municipal Detroit and Boston. You think about it in those terms. Another, from the processes of destruction to those of building, another important point to think about when we talk about housing politics is that since 1967, the Israeli government has built tens of thousands of housing units for Israeli Jews in East Jerusalem alone. Not one unit have they built for Palestinians. And so this is a small settlement. This is in Sheikh Jarrah. What the film, of course, did, the film did many good things, did many things well. It didn't have time to do everything. But but one thing that it did do right at the beginning was not to obfuscate what these so-called neighborhoods in East Jerusalem are, which in the popular mainstream American press are often regarded as neighborhoods, not as illegal settlements. These settlements in East Jerusalem, which house about at least 200,000 Israeli Jews by this late date, are all illegal under international law, and there's a very broad international consensus. I dug up a map the other night trying to look for maps of the most recent sort of cartographic realities in the city, and the CIA produces maps. You won't be surprised to hear on Jerusalem. And the CIA, in their designation, they designate everything built over the 67 border, over the armistice line of 49 as settlement. And so, depending on what State Department official you ask, on what day you might get different answers. But this is the idea that East Jerusalem is occupied territory, as occupied as Hebron or Nablus or Ramallah were or are, depending on your perspective, is something that has to be emphasized. But how much time? 1 minute. Okay. These meta-statistical realities and the way you quantify oppression and domination quantitatively is really important. But one thing that I learned, I might say, as an anthropologist is that, and one thing that I really liked about Julia's film is that it's important also to talk about this conflict and to talk about the kind of richly textured accounts of everyday life that go on, the kind of everyday forms of suffering and humiliation and degradation that go on, that are depicted, I think, in many ways very nicely by your film. One Palestinian who was facing, and many hundreds of Palestinians have been served demolition orders by the Israeli state and are waiting for that order to be served and their house to be destroyed. One Palestinian residing in such precarious straits once told me, it's like, I don't know when this is going to happen. It could happen any morning at 6 in the morning, and it's really quite like living fear on simmer all the time. And those everyday lived realities are things that often get lost in depictions, representations, and understandings of life for Palestinians and Israelis in this city and under military occupation. And I just want to sort of mention that, and that because I'm out of time, I will maybe in question and answer what we can do is because I was intrigued by some of the discourse of these settlers who Danny reminds me are of the most extreme variety. But statements like, as they said, and my Hebrew is not good enough to know if this translates, in blood and fire we will kick out the Arabs.
That's accurate.
Hebrew, okay. Well, then it's objectionable not only on racist grounds, but on grammatical and stylistic ones as well.
It rhymes in Hebrew. All right, I'm going to have to call a halt. Thank you very much. It rhymes in Hebrew. Yeah.
We didn't want to
we'll talk about it later.
I think that first of all, it was wonderful the way you put your. I admire the way you put the film in the context of what juxtaposition is all about, and the powerful way you demonstrated on a particular family, and actually with two families, an Israeli family and a Palestinian family, the impact of the conflict. I also very much want to congratulate Daniel for, I think, very powerfully connecting the micro-level issue to a much broader conflict. And also, finally, I think Thomas usefully invoked notions of justice, and you were about to demonstrate the rhetorical excesses of some settlers, and of course one could just as easily demonstrate rhetorical excesses of some Palestinian groups as well. And I think the challenge, what I'm going to do in 5 minutes, is simply pose, I'm going to put it in a somewhat larger context. I think a big question is, given that Jerusalem is one of the so-called final status issues, of whether peace is possible, given the complexities of what's going on in Jerusalem. And I simply want to very briefly make the following distinctions. First, there's the question of municipal Jerusalem. Municipal Jerusalem is a large area which has been, by the Israelis, annexed. The Israelis view municipal Jerusalem now as part of Israel. The rest of the world doesn't recognize it. The Israeli government. The rest of the world doesn't recognize it, but municipal Jerusalem is a big area. And one question, of course, is the Clinton formula for one solution, a two-state solution, poses the question, could you create two viable capitals out of this larger municipal area? And I just wanted to bring the audience some good news, and then there's plenty of bad news. The good news is that Jerusalem, in many ways, is already a divided city. There are neighborhoods that are almost exclusively Jewish, and there are neighborhoods that are almost exclusively Arab. It's very segregated. It is also true that since 1967, there's been an expansion, a purposeful expansion, of some areas that have become Jewish areas. Nonetheless, if one wants to be optimistic, it turns out, because there have been people that have done work on this, it would be possible to divide Jerusalem in a way where the Jews living in Jewish neighborhoods could be divided from the Arabs living in Arab neighborhoods, and it would require the displacement of only, the estimates vary, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 Jews who are now living in Arab neighborhoods. So I wanted to bring the audience a little bit of good news, if someone in the audience is interested in pursuing a two-state solution. A second huge issue has nothing to do with metropolitan Jerusalem, especially, but with the Old City. And the Old City obviously has enormous symbolic importance and religious importance to three great monotheistic religions. And the question about the Old City is, are there ways of making arrangements for its governance that might permit peace? And there has once again been a vast amount of work done by people on this question. And indeed, one of our, Daniel, has been part of doing a lot of this work with respect to the Old City. One solution, I'll put it in quotes because none of these have happened at all, is a territorial sovereignty model where Jerusalem would essentially be divided between a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, the Old City of Jerusalem. A second is a special regime model in which there would be international control of Jerusalem. And a third would be a hybrid model, and Daniel's done some work on a hybrid model, which would try to incorporate some of the best features of both. Lest you think these issues are going to be simple, outside of the Old City, it turns out, there are a number of religious sites in what's called the historic basin, which is bigger than the Old City. And as you can imagine, I say this, we're not going to go into any detail on any of this, issues of what the governance structure might be there, even if you had a special governance structure for the Old City, would have to be worked out. This is only to say that for those of us interested in negotiation, it is my view that a negotiated resolution might be possible. Thank you very much. I want to leave it on a point that I think was raised, which I think is a very powerful point. And I want to thank Daniel for it. It's one thing if this conflict is viewed as a political conflict and a legal conflict, a profoundly difficult political and legal conflict. It is quite another thing if this is viewed or is transformed into something that is seen primarily as a religious conflict. And I think what Daniel said bears a lot, it's good to think about. Because there are people, I assure you, having studied this conflict on both sides, who are eager to frame this conflict in religious, historical terms. And I think that what I will simply say, as someone who's a student of negotiation and not a Middle Eastern expert, is if there's going to be a resolution, it's going to be most helpful if people can frame it in terms of, given our respective underlying interests that are not entirely coincident, how in the future can we search for solutions that are fair and reasonable and just? And it's not going to be easy, but I want to close the evening on the hopeful note that it may be possible. Thank you very much.